is going to take a few minutes, but I want to talk about something, a video I watched over the weekend that I think is very important. So Double Line Capital CEO Jeff Gundlach, he's on our Smart Money Tracker. I've followed him for several years now because I think he has good insights into what's going on, especially at a macro level. He's a billionaire asset manager, and he made wide-ranging remarks last week about several topics, including a scenario for American prosperity following a period of uncertainty and pain. So, at least according to him, there may be some light at the end of the tunnel, but it's going to get pretty dark in the interim. So, we'll just take these one by one. First of all, he starts talking about the 2024 election. By the way, this is a video that was published for clients, and then they later published excerpts of this video, segments of this video, and they put it on YouTube. I have the link in this morning's report if you'd like to watch it. On the 2024 election, Gundlach has warned now for several election cycles that a presidential election is likely to be decided by the House due to a breakdown of the Electoral College. And he leaves this pretty open, not a prediction, but he did share his concerns that this election could be decided by the House, especially if there's some big disagreement in the Electoral College. He also cited the 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln, who carried 40% of the popular vote, but won the Electoral College, and that, of course, spurred the secession of southern states. Later in his remarks, he comments on the fourth turning. We're going to cover that in a separate point, but he talked about the fourth turning. He said he believes it's here, and he implied during this segment that the domestic conflict could occur. And again, this is not a prepper website or some doomsday YouTube channel. This is a billionaire bond manager who's talking about this stuff and has been talking about this now for the past 8+ years now or so. Gundlach, he goes on to talk about the federal insolvency problem in the 2028 election. Gundlach believes that the unsustainable fiscal situation will dominate the 2028 election because Medicaid and Social Security are both officially to run out of money by 2030 and 2032, respectively. And on the topic of Social Security, it's the old age benefits that specifically, it's the old age trust that's going to be running out of money. And he said because of this, he actually believes that the CBO projections are optimistic because they assume 3% interest rates, and we have 5% interest rates today. The CBO Congressional Budget Office projections also assume a 3 to 4% budget deficit, and we have a 6.5% budget deficit today. He also says CBO projections do not take into account a recession. And so Gundlach believes that Medicaid and Social Security will actually run out of money by 2027 or 2028, forcing that as an election issue. He says, quote, I think the 2028 election, there will be nothing else, meaning no other topics. He says, how are we going to deal with this? We have 212 trillion of unfunded liabilities. Do you know what the total assets are in the United States? 190 trillion. So we're what you call bankrupt. If we were a hedge fund, we'd be praying every night that we don't get a margin call because our liabilities exceed our assets. One of the other things on Friday, I published a weekly economic outlook, and it included my notes on a debate about the future of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And specifically, they were debating, will the United States dollar retain its world reserve status after 2030? And on one side, you have Jim Rickards, was probably the most well-known guy on the side that believes, Jim Rickards believes that a BRICS common currency backed by gold is going to replace the dollar as the world reserve. On the other side, you have a really smart guy. I like this guy a lot. His name's Brent Johnson. He runs Santiago Capital. He's the creator of the dollar milkshake theory, which basically says the dollar is very safe in the interim. And he said he thinks the dollar is going to retain its world reserve status. And I bring this up because in that argument, Rickards talks about Ken Rogoff. Ken Rogoff is a Harvard economist, and he has this thing called a doom loop. And the doom loop refers to the problems that governments encounter when they are stuck in these debt traps. And so Jim Rickards talked about the 3 ways that countries can escape doom loops, potentially escape a doom loop. And the first is by just outright default. And he said the United States is not at risk of outright default because the Fed can just print money. They have to print trillions of dollars, which they probably will, and pay down America's debt. The second thing was debt restructuring. And then the third thing is just debasing your currency, devaluing your currency to pay off the debt. But I want to talk about debt restructuring. Rickards says this is unlikely, but Gundlach actually talked about coming debt restructuring for the United States. And he believes that the U.S. Treasury is going to be forced to restructure the debt, but he is optimistic about America's future after that. He said, quote, the debt restructuring will actually be a cathartic event, I think, when we do it, and it will lead to a period of potential prosperity. but between here and there lies the valley. Now, let's get to the valley. On the topic of the next recession, Gunlock says he expects a recession this year. He says if it's not this year, though, it is almost certainly within the next 18 to 24 months. Gunlock said monetary and fiscal response, everything we've seen from every recession I've been alive in, which is cutting interest rates and passing stimulus, he says that's going to fuel another spike of inflation. So it is coming. This is something that we can, like death and taxes, we can just expect that it's going to happen. Now, on the topic of the fourth turning, Gunlock also addressed this theory called the fourth turning, and he agreed with demographer Neil Howe that the United States is soon going to be hit with a major internal or external war. It could potentially be both. The fourth turning is a generational cycle theory that claims basically you have this cycle of four turnings, and every fourth turning generates a major conflict. And Neil Howe talks about the English Civil War as a fourth turning, the American Revolution as the next fourth turning, the Civil War as the next fourth turning, World War II as the next fourth turning. This thing is cyclical. And he says the next fourth turning should peak by 2030. And for those over on the Early Warning Network, I did publish a video talk through of that book, and I provide the link in this morning's report. Now, on the topic of the fourth turning, here's what Gunlock had to say. Quote, "This all has to be fixed, and fixed doesn't mean we go back and pretend that it's like 1965 again, which is what all these octogenarian politicians seem to act like. They act like we have endless amounts of money. They act like we're the strongest we've ever been, that we dominate the world, and it's just not true. And so we can't go back. We have to go forward, and I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's going to be restructuring all these liabilities." He continues, "We're probably going to have to kind of readjust the currency, to do some backing to it, to some discipline, some sort of guiding mechanisms. And this is very interesting. This is a very interesting time, because I used to talk about this 20 years ago and say, don't worry about it. It's 25 years away. But now it's 20 years later, and so it's only a few years away, and this is going to be quite the wild ride." He says the Federal Reserve might have to kind of cancel a lot of the institutions, and later he refers to those institutions are the debt, the tax code, maybe the Federal Reserve itself. He continues that we've been using and come up with some better ones that people can believe in. This decade is going to be a wild ride if he's correct about that, because we're going to see something like, if Gunlock is correct, we're going to see something like debt restructuring of Argentina or Greece, and it's going to be very painful. And this is something that Nouriel Roubini has also talked about. Basically, that his base case, if I recall correctly from his book Mega Threats, which I read and we also covered, 1 to 2 years ago, his base case, if I recall correctly, is that the United States is going to have Argentina-like problems, and that is, I think, very likely to hit us this decade. On the topic of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, Gunlock believes the next recession will, quote-unquote, accelerate the trend of competition against the dollar as the world reserve currency. He said that a digital currency would be attractive for those in power because it would provide more surveillance tools. And he's not talking about Bitcoin here. He's talking about central bank digital currency, or a digital dollar. Now, none of this is financial advice. It is mainly informed speculation here from Gunlock, but he did post this video to YouTube, I think probably because I think Gunlock is a decent guy, and he wants to share his concerns about upcoming economic, financial, and monetary turbulence. I followed Gunlock now for several years. I found him to be a good source of perspective, informed and prescient, and I'm sharing this with you now because I thought it was important for me just to help inform my perspective on what the rest of this decade could look like, and because I also think the Gunlock could be right about it all.